Greetings all, and welcome to Behind the Curtain. This is a chance for us to talk about really the movers and shakers in the music industry over the past few decades. A look at people who oftentimes don't get talked about, but whose contributions are essential. I'm Steve, and this is Dave. And Dave, you want to talk a little bit more about what we're thinking about in terms of Behind the Curtain?
Yeah, okay. Behind the curtain, because these are not the people that get out on stage. These are not the people who are making music videos. They're not the faces that we know and love. But they're essential to the music history. They're producers, songwriters, composers, people that get album credits, but whom you may never have heard of. And even the ones that you have heard of, and I think the person we're going to be talking about today is probably one of them. And always stand to learn a little bit more about these people, and it's a chance for us to give them credit for doing some incredible work.
Absolutely. And so today we're going to start with George Martin. George Martin, who is widely credited with helping the Beatles become, frankly, the Beatles, and has been given the moniker of the fifth Beatle, and a moniker that I think is, is richly deserved. And so,
yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of people have been given that title, the fifth Beatle. We have Brian Epstein, their manager. The K, a New York disc jockey who pushed them in their early days of Beatlemania in America.
Right.
We have Billy Preston, who played on the Let It Be album. Just all sorts of people. Pete Best, who was the Beatle before they became famous. So a lot of people have been called the fifth Beatle, but I think we agree that it's probably most accurate in this case. In fact, one of the critics said it would probably be more accurate to say he was the third or fourth Beatle.
Yeah, it's he obviously had an enormous contribution. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the studio. But it's worth noting that Martin himself was a person, fairly humble background, and not necessarily born into a musical home. He had only just a handful of lessons, piano lessons, for example, as a kid. But he had a kind of gift. I think that they had a kind of musical gift, and I think that this is oftentimes overlooked, that he had a feel for music and understanding of music, and he also had a kind of intuition that separated him certainly from other producers. If I could, just a couple things about his earliest years. Again, he grew up in the UK. He spent some time in World War II as an observer. He enlisted for the war at 17. An observer was a person who sat alongside a pilot and essentially kind of, it was a reconnaissance effort, and so he was sort of the eyes, and to some degree the ears of the pilot. Paul McCartney mentioned that Martin's role as an observer in the war was sort of his first producing gig, which is, I think, an interesting way of thinking about it. Martin never saw combat, but he did spend a lot of time in the Caribbean. That's where he did most of his training during the war, and he had a real strong feeling for the Caribbean for the rest of his life.
And ended up creating his own studio there, which was also a huge thing. All sorts of famous people produced there, but we'll talk about that more later.
Yeah, but he after the war, then he did have an opportunity to have some formal music training on the oboe, for example, as well as the piano, and he eventually found his way into production. And he was, again, a formally trained producer. But I think it would be fair to say that the 1950s and George Martin, in terms of production, he was on the outskirts. He wasn't given very many important assignments, and frankly, Martin was pigeonholed as a producer of comedy albums. I mean, just to be blunt, he worked with a whole host of British comedians. Some of them actually quite famous. I suppose the most famous would be people like Peter Sellers,
Dudley Moore. Well, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, you know who Dudley Moore was.
Yeah, it's.
I'm not sure anybody else does now, but
I'm not sure either. But it was. It is curious that Martin becomes sort of the go-to producer for comedy records in the UK, and here we have an image of Martin working alongside Peter Sellers.
Well, that was one of his first hits, right? The Peter Sellers, Sophia, Loren, oh my gracious, or goodness gracious, something like that.
Yeah, that's it. Kind of a comedy, a kind of lighthearted comedy record. He also then had he also worked with the Goons, Harry Seacombe, Peter Sellers, and Spike Milligan, who are a very famous group, comedy ensemble in Britain. In fact, they were sort of the defining comedy ensemble in the 1950s and early 1960s. A group.
And Monty Python guys talk about.
Yeah.
These people being the source of inspiration for them when they were growing up.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, it was his work with the Goons, and in particular, that gave him certain credibility with the Beatles. We should maybe talk about a little bit about the meeting of how the Beatles and Martin come together, because it's honestly, it's a very odd pairing. You want to talk about that a little bit with
Sure.
1972?
Martin was approached by Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. He came with an acetate and said, "Here, listen, this is my group. We'd like you to give them a record contract." And Martin has talked about this hundreds of times. It's something everybody asks him about.
That's right.
He said he just wasn't impressed by what he heard there, and he said, right. If you're asking me to sign them based on what I've heard here, I'll have to take a pass." But he said Epstein was so downfallen, and he struck him as being an upright, serious young man. So he thought he'd give him another chance. He said, "Well, look, bring him down here. I'll give him an hour in the studio, and we'll see." So
that's right.
So that's what happened. Steve, you want to talk about the day in June?
The day in June, is this
June 2nd when they showed up for their hour?
So you're right. And so when they went in,
the fateful day in June.
Fateful day, right? And so this is they play some tunes for him. To be frank, Martin's not impressed with really anything, and but Martin makes them a deal. I mean, you play for a while, then we come into the studio, and then we can talk about things that you like and things that you don't like, right? And so I think this is where we're headed with this. And so they play for a while. They come into the studio, and they hear some the playback, and Martin asks the lads about, what are the things that you don't particularly like, and it's Harrison, right, who says, "Well,
right.
we can start with that tie. I don't like that," and I guess the rest of the guys were just horrified. Crap, we just blown.
They're trying to get on his good side, right? They want him to give them a record contract.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and Harrison has blown it. But in fact, Martin talks about that he responded. Actually, he thought it was funny, and that he actually seems to sort of genuinely like these guys. Yeah,
that might have actually been their in fact.
I think so too. Yeah.
Just the fact that he was cheeky and just open enough to say what came into his head.
I think that's right. I think that we should, and so to that degree, I think we should maybe talk a little bit about the relationship between them, the personal relationship. George Martin was considerably older, by like 20 years or so, right? Older than the Beatles, and was certainly not a peer. And so he had a certain amount of I don't know what you would call it. I mean, McCartney's described him as a kind of father figure.
Gravitas?
Gravitas. Yeah, I think that's the word. Yeah, I think that's it. They were friendly, but there was a certain kind of distance there. But they were very simpatico in the studio. And maybe Dave, you can talk a bit about.
Let me just wrap up the story of the.
Yeah, wrap it up. Yeah, go ahead.
Session. It was this personal chemistry that got them the record deal. He said he wasn't sure what he was listening to there. He was used to a Cliff Richards type thing where you have a singer, you have the front man, and you have a backup group. And what he was hearing here were three singers, and they were all there was no backup group in that sense. They were all up front and they were all doing their thing. And he just wasn't sure what to do with it.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
He also wasn't that impressed with their musicianship. Wasn't impressed with the songs that they had written that he was hearing. But he just said they every one of them had charisma. You just felt good being around them.
They had a spark.
And I thought that, if they somehow get that across to an audience, they'll be huge. And so based on that chemistry, they got the record.
And I think what you talk about there with when he didn't hear a lead singer, I mean, the fact that he broke the mold, right? That there already was a fairly well-established tradition in rock music, popular music, and this group would break it really from the beginning, and then largely that's because of what Martin saw or maybe didn't see. I think it's
that's right. The whole rock music, pop music industry, that was in its infancy. And there were guys at the record company, and there was a competition, a rivalry to see who could land a hit with a rock group. And as I said, there wasn't much of it going on. They looked to America and saw what was going on there, and they said, we need some British rock groups. We need to be cashing in on this.
That's right.
And so part of his job from the beginning had been to find talent, to develop it, to develop his own projects. And so he was looking for someone. There were already a couple of groups out there. Cliff Richards had already had hits. So there were a handful of rock hits out there, and he was looking for his people. The conventional wisdom was you get a singer or a female singer, and that's your motor. That's the engine that you ride in. And so when they first came in, he was looking for, okay, who is it going to be? Which of these guys is it? And to his credit, he thought, no, they'd be together. So instead of sticking in that dogma, that role, he said, all right, let's try it all together. And that was to his credit.
It was to his credit. I think we'd agree that was always kind of the secret sauce for the Beatles, right? The fact that they were, in fact, these four lads, that they were a group, and that they each had, frankly, a lot to contribute. And to some degree, that's sort of Martin's doing. It's also worth noting that Martin had no experience with popular music, with this nascent rock. It's none. He just had it was almost kind of raw instinct. I mean, it's just really the whole thing. It's very intuitive. It's very improvisational in a way. But suddenly Martin says, that's what I've got, and we're going to go ahead with this. And the Beatles, to their credit, they were pretty naive. Not pretty naive. They're completely naive. And they knew that they needed a record deal. They knew that they needed a producer, and they were more than willing to follow Martin's lead. I think it's fair to say that if Martin had said, we're going to put Lennon out in front, that the Beatles would have followed or whatever. But they listened, and they started on that journey together. And so I think it's important to note that really.
And of course, at the very beginning, Pete Best was the drummer. Pete Best was the drummer that they took to the first session. And the story is that Martin asked Epstein to fire Pete Best. There's other stories that say that Epstein misunderstood what Martin was saying, and Martin said actually he was the best looking one of them, and in a group like that, good looks are important.
Yeah, that really matters.
He wasn't really interested in getting rid of Pete Best. He wanted to get a session player in there to play some of the drums,
which was very common in that era.
Which I think they did for "Love, Love Me Do."
Yeah, that's right. It's Ringo's entry into the Beatles. There's a lot of there are several stories, right, that sort of how he actually made his way into the Beatles, or how Best made his got the pink slip. I mean, but what we know is that Martin was there and had a role, whatever that role was, in getting Ringo into the group. And so really at that point, the four lads and Martin start off on this journey together. And Martin shows them how to use the studio and how to make, essentially, right, they become a studio band. I mean, it's when Martin meets them, they've played live, and that's all they've really done. And they were a relatively hot live band. But over the span of maybe 3 or 4 years, they make that transition from really basically a live only band, just to really a kind of band that's almost only in the studio. It's few bands have made that transition, such a stark transition in such a short amount of time. Martin is there.
Well, that's absolutely right. And again, this is where Martin gets the credit for that entirely. If we take a look at Yesterday,
yeah,
I think that might be a key experience. McCartney wrote it, played the piano on it, and Martin came and said, "It's a nice song. Let's put some strings in there." And McCartney said, "No, that's really don't need to go that way, And apparently Martin said, "Well, look, I'll write an arrangement, and we'll record some strings. If you don't like what you hear, we'll throw it out." Right. And that's what happened. They recorded it. McCartney did like what he heard. And let's be honest, without the strings, Yesterday is the most covered. It's outrageously popular and has been from the beginning.
One of the most covered songs of the 20th century, for sure.
And can we imagine it having been that without the string arrangement? Do you think people would have gone so crazy for Yesterday?
I don't think they would have. No, I don't think they would have. Now, the string arrangement was extremely unusual in this time. Pop records, whatever, pop groups just didn't use strings. This comes to, Martin's, not only his genius, but also to some degree his formal training. I mean, Martin knew what he was doing. We've both heard, right, acoustic versions of Yesterday, even acoustic versions of Yesterday from McCartney, and they're fine. But it is the strings. The strings do separate the song and make it, they make it Yesterday. And Martin would be doing this, really sort of time after time. That would be Martin's suggestions. Eleanor Rigby is another example of
right. But I think after that, McCartney was really opened his
Oh, I
eyes
think that's right.
to the possibilities that he really hadn't seen before. And from that point on, he was all about what can we do to make this song more interesting.
I think that that's absolutely right. And I think of the four Beatles, I think it's McCartney, who maybe was the most involved in the production at that time. But it's McCartney who forged, I think, the closest relationship with Martin, and would continue on. Would be one of really the only Beatle to have a long-lasting kind of professional relationship with Martin. And it starts, I think, largely with Yesterday. I think you're absolutely right. That is that kind of pivotal moment where Martin puts his stamp on it, and where McCartney in particular says, yeah, this guy, he knows what he's doing. I mean, it's magic, it really is.
And I would maintain that the Beatles were able to do that, bring some strings into it, as you said, that's not part of pop music, that's not part of rock, but they had already established such a solid body of work up until that point, just in 2 years previous.
Right.
That people were not turned off by that. They did not say, "Oh, what's this?"
Well,
no, it was Beatles, so it was okay.
That's the other thing, right? That there is a certain. I mean, the audience, the Beatles audience, largely came along with the group, right? As the group then became more experimental and certainly more of a studio group, they followed along and they never abandoned them. I mean, it's if you listen to the albums, if you listen to, I mean, even the span of like a year or two, there is a pretty dramatic difference. I mean, you listen to Help, and then you listen to Revolver. I mean, they're only separated by a couple of years, but they're vastly different recordings. Well, the audience, the audience came along with them, and certainly I think Martin is part of that, and he helped to cultivate that audience. It's a very interesting relationship as they all are working together in the studio. They're growing, evolving with each other. Again, I mean, it's important to note that Martin is, he's learning this along with them. I mean, Martin doesn't have any experience with pop groups. He doesn't have any experience with rock music. And essentially, at some point here, he's basically exclusively working with the Beatles. It's all he knows, and they grow together. Real quickly, I think we should also note that Martin was always, I mean, even with the success of the Beatles, his relationship with the production company and the recording studio, EMI, was always pretty fraught. And I think by almost any measure, they treated him pretty poorly. They paid him.
Yeah, they screwed him over.
Yeah, £3,000 a year, something like that. There were no royalties. In fact, there weren't even, I guess, any end of the year bonuses, which other producers got. And it's not completely clear to me what was going on there, but it was clear that they did not have any appreciation for what Martin was doing. And that actually then forced Martin's hand, right? That Martin, relatively early in all this, mid-60s, creates his own production company, his own studio. He basically becomes a kind of independent contractor.
I think as early as 65. It was very early.
Very early, yeah. And it's I think that's important too, because as important as Martin was, and I think this was almost universally acknowledged, the studio didn't. It just, I don't know if it was personal or what, but yeah, so Martin then becomes, he pulls away and creates his own company. He partners again with a guy named Jeff Emmerich, who spends a lot of time in the studio with him. And really from that point on, Martin becomes sort of a producer's producer, circa like 1965, 1966. He arguably, along with, I think, with Phil Spector, becomes the most famous producer in the world.
Right, and I think it's probably just has a lot to do with the fact that the ties in the upper echelon really didn't understand what a producer does. They did not understand what he was doing for the Beatles, how he was contributing to their success, and I think that's what it comes down to. But
yeah,
then he went independent, and as an independent producer, produced the last few Beatles albums.
Yeah, and and those last few Beatles albums, Sgt. Pepper, in particular, I think. Those last Beatles albums are almost wholly studio creations. They are considered some of the finest recordings in the history of recorded music. People study the techniques involved in the studio. A lot of innovative techniques, right, with slowing tapes, a whole host of kind of studio experiments that Martin was at the center.
Right, the backward tapes, use of feedback, all that stuff. And he was playing an increasingly large role in the creative work of the group. Strawberry Fields Forever, there were two versions of it that were done.
Yes.
One of them was with the orchestra, and one was a more simple one. And John said, they're both good. Like them both. Let's just put them together. The trouble is, we're in a different key. They had a different tempo. It was virtually impossible to do.
How do you do
that?
Right.
Martin, how do you do it? Martin found a way. He slowed down the tempo of the orchestra, changing the key somewhat by doing that, and all of a sudden it worked. So
it's interesting.
That's the sort of contribution he was making. He was scoring. He was writing all the scores. He was playing piano, playing some other instruments. He was an essential part of their song crafting.
He absolutely was. And given that almost all of the work the Beatles were doing as the Beatles happened in the studio, Martin was there virtually all the time. And so, and there are a number of instances where, they're in the studio and they, somebody suggests something, we should try this. And then like the next day, Martin's able then to somehow replicate this idea that one of them had. It's really quite extraordinary. It is the case though, that as the Beatles evolved and as the group became frankly more complicated and a bit less harmonious, let's say, that Martin, he grew a little tired of some of this. Maybe you want to talk. Can you want to talk a bit about the Get Back sessions and just
Well, apparently, it really started with the White Album. They had already been to India. Paul and Ringo left early. At some point, even John and George became somewhat disillusioned. But the fact that that was already the first split, and the White Album, I think the White Album is brilliant, but it's largely just a bunch of individual contributions.
It certainly seems that way, from
Beatles coming in and their song, recording their song. The other guys will play on it, or sometimes they won't. And that was the beginning of the end, I think. Yoko Ono was already in the studio.
Yeah.
I think this was one of the problems that Martin had. Anyway, it was becoming very tense and less playful, less harmonious.
I think that's exactly.
And after that, he basically just opted out.
Yeah, he bailed. It's really interesting that, and if you think about it, Martin is again at this point, right, maybe the most famous producer in the world. He's considered the fifth Beatle. The fact that he would sort of step away from working with them, I think, says something about the tension and just how ill at ease he must have been in that situation. Because you could imagine another person just basically kind of say, I'm going to suck it up. We're going to just make this work, whatever. But he just didn't want any part of it. And the Get Back sessions then, right? It's quite famous, right? Phil Spector is brought in, who is, I guess, probably at that point the other most famous producer in the world, but who is a difficult person.
The first part of that was Martin was still involved
That's right.
To a certain
That's right.
extent. And but it ended. I mean, they had to find someone else because that's where he really drew the line and said,
That's it. Yeah.
Just not working for me.
So he withdraws. Spector comes in. Those sessions.
Glenn Johns first.
Glenn Johns and he's not around very long either. I mean, at that point, it's much of this is documented in the film Let It Be, and you can see the tension there is palpable. But so those recording sessions end. The Beatles want to make another album, and they approach Mark. Maybe you want to talk.
Well, Paul McCartney approaches Martin. Yeah. He's the spokesman and says, we'd like to do another album, and Martin says, I'm not interested. He says, no, we'd like to get back together in the studio as like we used to do. Right. Like, make an album like we used to make. And Martin said, okay, well, is everybody on board with this? Yes, we're all in agreement. Even John?
Even John.
Yes, John wants you to come back. Yeah. So they made Abbey Road as their last album. It was not the last album to be released, but it was the last album to be made. And just brilliant.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that makes Abbey Road so beloved is the fact that, that Martin's on board there. You can almost feel the energy on that album. It just feels much more harmonious. But Martin talked about that during those sessions, the recording sessions, that he knew that he could sense that this was probably the last record that they would make together. I mean, it was just given the nature of the group and where they were headed with their own individual lives. But he had a very good feeling about it. I mean, it felt like a proper kind of conclusion. I mean, he was pretty open about that. But he also, he was under no illusions that there would be, another record with the Beatles. He knew that would be the end. So Martin then, so it's like 19.
Yeah, I think they all had the sense that they were making their last album.
And so the Beatles dissolve, and Martin is there he is, right? He has built at this point built his own recording studio. He's his own man, and it's like, well, what will he do? I mean, this isn't Martin in the 70s. In some ways, it's really some of the most interesting time in his career, in that he ends up working with a number of figures. Coming out of the disillusionment, though, Martin actually works with Ringo. Martin produces Ringo's first solo album, A Sentimental Journey, which is basically an album of standards. Ringo wanted to make an album that his mom would like, and so it's music from the 30s and 40s. It's a very unusual album, but there is Martin at the controls. It's Martin does spend time, though, with all the Beatles. Martin spends the most time working with McCartney in the 70s. And in fact, Martin goes on to produce a whole host, right, of McCartney solo efforts. He works with McCartney on the Live.
This is for Wings.
There we go.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, it's
produced the Live and Let Die.
Right.
James Bond. That was his second James Bond title song.
Yeah, the first was.
Which one was the first?
It was Shirley Bassey's, right? That's Shirley Bassey. Was it Goldfinger, right?
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Goldfinger.
It's Martin even during the 60s found time to work with other artists. Cleo Lane is another artist he worked with. He also worked with Gerry and the Pacemakers, the Mersey beat sound. But in the 70s, right, Martin is starting to look to other groups. I think, for my money,
Jeff
Beck, and I think the Jeff Beck thing we would just talk about.
Blow by Blow. Yeah,
Blow by Blow. Jeff Beck, a guitarist. Jeff Beck was in the Yardbirds, famously in the Yardbirds. Jeff Beck then worked very closely with Rod Stewart. and produced, worked with him for a couple of albums, very highly acclaimed albums. But Beck is a kind of mercurial figure, always moving from one style to the next, and someone who is considered relatively difficult to deal with. He approached Martin about working together, and they came together in the mid-70s for 2 albums. And the first of them is this one, cover of it here, Blow by Blow. Second was Wired. These are considered kind of seminal albums. If you're a fusion, if you're interested in jazz fusion, if you're interested in guitar virtuosity, Blow by Blow and Wired are really sort of the albums, 74, 75. It's just, they're extraordinary, and they're very different from the work with the Beatles, very different from other things that he had done, but they're incredible works, and people who are into that music, I mean, that's really sort of at the top of the list. And I think a lot of people consider them to be Jeff Beck's best works. And while they never worked together afterwards, I think even Beck acknowledges that their work together was, well, Martin got the best out of Beck. Now, there was another group, right? Another group that approached Martin in the early 70s, mid to early 70s, a group of 3 guys, a group called America. Maybe we'll just talk about that a little bit. Martin's work with America. America hit the scene right in the early 70s with Horse with No Name. They made a couple albums after that. And then Martin linked up with them. And
I think he produced a total of four albums.
That's right.
With America. And so clearly that was also a situation where there was a chemistry, where there was a synergy in the studio. And these were people that he felt he could work with. And I'm sure they felt like they hit the jackpot when they got him as a producer.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Martin obviously was a very well-known figure at this point. And so when they got together, whatever Martin said, they listened, and they were extremely excited to be working with him. It's Martin who produces 3 of America's biggest hits. Tin Man, Lonely People, and Sister Golden Hair. And Tin Man, which is, I think, maybe the high watermark for America. Beautiful song. You know, it's Martin who's on the piano at the end of that song. There's the last 20 seconds, 30 seconds of that song, you can hear this piano. That's actually Martin playing alongside the lads. Martin was always a big supporter of America. He thought of them as a group with a certain kind of clarity. I think that Martin added, we used the word gravitas a little bit, I think that he added something to them. I think the association between America and Martin really benefited America without question. I can even remember in the 70s hearing that America was working with Martin, and that those albums, that kind of pairing, it gives like, there's a sort of added, it's like, there we go. Like the guy who worked with the Beatles, now he's interesting stuff. And so you paid attention to America in a way that you didn't before.
Right. And virtually everyone who has worked with Martin talks about what a great producer he is. I haven't heard anybody who said, no, you know what, he was just bringing anything to the game, and I'm glad to be rid of him. They're full of praise and talk about his style. He's has a very cooperative style. He makes helpful suggestions, shows them possibilities that they didn't see before, but is not very demanding in terms of do it this way. That's just not part of his style. That's just not
part of it. Yeah, I think many producers have a kind of sound. There's a kind of distinctive sound associated with them. I think most, notably Phil Spector. But Martin was he worked with the artists in that regard, as you're suggesting. He followed their lead. It was very cooperative, and I think you're absolutely right. There's no one had, when it came to his work in the studio, no one had a bad word to say for him. I think maybe the latter decades of his life are interesting in that Martin obviously was an enormously famous figure. I mean, it's the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles are arguably the most famous people maybe ever in the world, and Martin was really kind of right alongside them, and so his level of fame was profound. It is the case, though, right, that much of his work in the latter years of his life were there to sort of protect the legacy of the Beatles a bit. As we move from the 80s and 90s into the 21st century, I mean, obviously the Beatles had stopped recording, but Martin was, how would you describe that? I mean, it's interesting. He's a kind of caretaker of the recorded legacy to some degree.
Well, right, and he obviously had hundreds of hours of recorded material from the Beatles that no one had heard. And so he put out with Giles, his son, they produced the Love CD, which was basically a rethinking of a lot of the Beatles classics. But yes, he was very protective of the legacy, as you say, to the point that he was not involved with the reunion cuts, Free Like a Bird.
And yes, I can't think of the top of my head. Right.
Jeff Lynne produced those.
Jeff Lynne produced those. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, so they this is where the then three living Beatles then used some studio work that Lennon had left in the can.
And Martin said he probably would have approached it differently. But he probably would have produced if they had asked him, but they just didn't ask him.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. I mean, that's another guy, right? Jeff Lynne, who as a producer has a very distinctive sound. It's unmistakable, right? Whether Jeff Lynne's working with the Wilburys or he's working with the remaining Beatles, is with Tom Petty, or even his solo work. It's like, oh yeah, that's Jeff Lynne, and you could never say that about Martin. I guess in the end, as we think about Martin, and we think about his contributions, I think one of the things that he did is that he elevated the position of the producer. I mean, wouldn't you agree that following Martin's work with the Beatles, even casual fans, music fans, paid a little more attention to the production side of things and who was in the studio working with the groups, and that's a feature of Martin.
I think that's right. I know that was the case for me, and it's a lot like for movies now.
Yes,
I still have no idea what a producer does for a movie. Not why a movie is better for having had this producer. I have a sense of that for music, and probably because of George Martin.
Yeah, I think that's true for me too. Martin, when you would read about the Beatles, you would also read about Martin to the degree that you really started to pay more attention to producers just in general. I guess it's fair to say that I guess in terms of recording and producing, that Martin's last great achievement was working with Elton John in the wake of Princess Diana's death, and it's Martin who produced the reworking of Candle in the Wind in 1997, which I believe became the highest, the biggest selling single maybe of all time.
I think that's right. Yeah,
massive recording.
Yeah.
And Martin had produced that, and I think that was sort of his last great sort of effort as a producer. Martin died a few years ago. He won the Order of British Empire. He became Sir George Martin. Just in terms of Martin as the first figure in our Behind the Curtain series, why start with him? Do you think, Dave? Why was it important here to talk about Martin in this regard? What about Martin do you think made why was he so significant, and why is this a place for us to start as we think about these other people who are behind the scenes but critically important? Why start with Martin?
Well, he arguably had more influence on the music that was being made by the people in front of the curtain,
yeah,
than virtually any other figure I can think of in history. So, yeah, he seemed like the obvious choice.
Yeah, I think so too. And so we're excited to bring you this. We're going to periodically talk about these figures, and we have a whole host of them, and it's quite a varied list. But we think it's important because as fans of music, it's important to know, who's, as Dave said, in front of the curtain. But it's also important to know who's behind the curtain. And George Martin was an important place for us to start. And so, thanks for watching and listening, and we will talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.